When it comes to rally, you can probably name a great many iconic cars from years gone by. And yes, while it is very fun to talk about and watch these things in action, sometimes it's also fun to change tracks and look at the rally cars that, in the end, left very little to no impact on the sport whatsoever. So today, it's time to dig out the history books and examine some of the forgotten rally cars. One thing to remember going into this is that most if not all of these cars aren't truly forgotten, just overshadowed by their contemporaries. After all, not every car can be an Audi Quattro or a Subaru Impreza. Let's start off with a brand you don't normally associate with rallying, Ferrari. The 308 GTB did actually see a fairly sizable rally campaign throughout the 70s and 80s, though with little success, which goes against the likes of their Formula 1 and Le Mans campaigns. The 308 Group 4 and Group B race cars were produced by Italian company Michael Otto, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who were closely tied to the Ferrari brand. The car was campaigned from 1978 to 1986, covering the late Group 4 years and Group B. The rally car would feature all the usual upgrades like a tubular chassis and mechanical fuel injection replacing the antiquated carburetors. The Group 4 car would end up producing around 290 to 330 brake horsepower. The Group 4 car would see competition until 1983, winning a few events including the 1979 Rally Monza. When the Group B rules rolled around, Michael Otto essentially directly upgraded the Group 4 cars to match the higher specifications. Most of the Group B entries were upgraded to a Quattro Valvoli system, the engine making a fairly tame 310 horsepower. Other upgrades included strengthened roll bars, upgraded brakes and wheels, and lighter suspension linkages. The Group B 308 weighed 66 kilograms more than the Group 4 308, so you can probably already see why it was never going to do well. While both versions were able to see some success in local rallies such as the Spanish Rally Championship, the highest the 308 was able to place in the WRC was a second place at the 1982 Tour de Corsa. Not necessarily on par with Ferrari's usual motoring successes, but you can't deny there is something truly special about seeing the prancing stallion taking on the off-road. The Japanese are pretty familiar with rally racing, with Toyota, Subaru and Mitsubishi all fighting for the title throughout the 1990s, but other ones didn't quite see that success. Mazda comes to mind here. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, Mazda would compete in the World Rally Championship. They first competed with the rear-wheel drive Mazda RX7 FB, which debuted at 11th place in the 1981 RAC Rally, and in 1984 would jump to Group B, with the iconic 13B rotary engine making around 300 horsepower. It would then see its first podium at the 1985 Acropolis Rally. Apart from that, it didn't see much more success here. The FB chassis was close to being replaced by the FC, and by 1985 it was clear that four-wheel drive was the way to go in rally competition. Mazda would then start work on a Group S RX7 prototype before Groups S and B were axed, and so they turned their attention to Group A, where they would find much more success. This time they raced the 323 four-wheel drive, which by the name of course had four-wheel drive, and a turbocharged 1.6 litre inline 4 making 250 horsepower, but it did find itself a niche. Sweden. Being smaller and more nimble, it was able to glide over the snow more effortlessly, and went on to win the event in both 1987 and 1989, as well as a 1-2 victory in the 1989 Rally New Zealand, plus many other podiums. That was Mazda's best year in the sport, with them taking third overall. I actually really like both of these cars. They were decidedly different from their competition, and I can't help but appreciate that. Another Japanese brand that never saw much recognition in this area was Daihatsu, which is admittedly a brand I've never really paid much attention to full stop. However, throughout the 1980s, Daihatsu campaigned their Charade primarily on the Safari Rally, which is arguably one of the hardest events on the rallying calendar, so merely finishing is an achievement. The tiny 3-cylinder Charade, however, would prove itself as worthy, winning multiple events in its class, even earning the nickname of the Little Giant Killer, really using its weight of just approximately 1,400 pounds to its advantage. Like the Mazda 323, it was set on proving that bigger isn't necessarily always better. Boys, you know what I'm talking about. There was even a turbo version proposed that was designed in collaboration with Daihatsu of all companies, creating the Charade 926R. It had a mid-mounted 1.3 litre turbo engine designed for use in Group B, though it was announced in 1985, and so you can probably see how that story ended. Daihatsu would later see much less competition with the Daihatsu Mira R4, though I'm guessing that that wasn't very successful as very little footage or information remains about it. The Germans too have some black sheep. The Opel Ascona 400 seems to be largely forgotten between Opel's more well-known rallying outings in the Kadett and the Manta, despite the fact that the Ascona is generally seen as more successful than the latter. It was first shown in 1979 to compete in the Group 4 category, specifically to compete with both the Fiat 131R Abarth and the Ford Escort RS 1800, featuring a typical chassis with rear-wheel drive. But when the revamp to the rules was announced a year later, it was redesigned to compete in Group B. It had an engine developed by the good people over at Cosworth, a 2.4 litre specimen making around 270 horsepower, which was developed from the engine used in the rally version of the Kadett. Despite a lot of infamous engine trouble throughout its short rallying career, it did win 4 WRC events in total, and managed to bag Opel second in the 1982 season, though getting first would have been near impossible when your main competitor is the Audi Quattro. Despite that, the Ascona did manage to take Walter Röhrl to his second driver's title in that same season, and actually remains the final rear-wheel drive car to help win the championship for drivers. Its final win and final event was at the 1983 Safari Rally, before it was quickly replaced by its more prestigious brother, the Manta, which was developed alongside the Ascona. Not really forgotten in the traditional sense, but because its best years were at the emergence of Group B with many other more powerful racers emerging too, it's safe to say that it remains overlooked. Now how about a Group B car that is forgotten but for a very different reason, the Alfa Romeo Alfasud Sprint 6C. What a name. Now I will admit that technically it isn't fair to compare cars that actually competed with a mere working concept, but it's an interesting car nonetheless, with a very similar story to that of the Mercedes 190e. They were both cars that never went rallying thanks to one car, the Audi Quattro. However, while the Merc did go on to have a career in other motorsports and has gone down in history as one of the best German cars ever made, the Sprint 6C never made it past the prototype stage. Originally, it was set to compete for the first time in the 1983 season, and 2 prototypes were apparently built, though only one was functional. It was to feature a 2.5 litre V6 sat in the middle, with a reported power output of around 160 horsepower. Evolution models were also planned, with displacement being increased to 3 litres and power jumping to well over 200. While the specific reason as to why the Alfasud never saw Group B competition, there are 2 factors that can be pointed to as to being responsible. One, Alfa Romeo was going through a difficult time financially in the early 1980s, and the 200 models required for homologation plus the later Evolution models could have helped bankrupt them. And secondly, during the design period, the Audi Quattro sprung up in competition and fairly quickly proved the superiority of 4-wheel drive, leaving the once hopeful Sprint 6C looking rather outdated. Therefore, the project was canned and it has been left to the pages of history, forgotten by most. Alfa Romeo has competed in other rallies before and since, but it never really gained much reputation in the sport to speak of. The final car for today is one from the early era that always fascinated me, and that was the Triumph TR7, a car that competed in Group 4 from 1976 to 1980. Despite being a British car from the 1970s, I do actually think this car looks the part, and I like it, despite a lot of reports of poor quality and design. But it's British Leyland in the 1970s, what can you expect? The competition version was even better, and the TR7 actually competed under 2 identities. From 1976 it was the base TR7 with the standard 2 litre inline 4 from the base car, but in 1978 was rehomologated as the TR7 V8, now with, you guessed it, a V8, in this case a 3.5 litre courtesy of Rover. Technically, it was homologated as the TR8, but as that model hadn't officially been launched yet, the former name was used instead. It did see a few wins throughout its career, such as the Ypres Rally in both 1978 and 1980, but despite showing some promise, Triumph was hemorrhaging money at the time, and TR7 production ended in 1981, and so factory support went out of the window with it. Triumph actually collapsed a few years after that in 1984, meaning the TR7 V8 is one of the last stands of this historic brand, which I really don't think is a bad image to end on. Of course, there are hundreds of rally cars throughout history that never created a lasting impact. Like I do on many of these videos, I will say that if you want a part 2, let me know in the comments down below, and tell me what are your favourite forgotten rally cars. Thank you so much for watching, with a very special thanks to Ben Wright and Brum Bryn, who are very generously donating at the highest tier on my Patreon. Just £1 a month is an amazing help, and I also have a Discord server and an Instagram page, links in the description below. Again, thank you for watching, and take care.